Captain Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the training field. Watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the obstacle course, the military base was alive with activity as soldiers jogged past in formation, their boots hitting the ground in perfect rhythm. She had been stationed at Fort Braxton for 3 weeks now, transferred from her previous post overseas. The adjustment back to life on domestic soil felt strange after 2 tours in hostile territory. She noticed the other officers gathering near the command tent. Colonel Raymond Parker was leading the briefing, his voice booming across the field, even from a distance. Sarah had heard stories about him during her first week. He was old-school military, the kind who believed physical fitness separated the warriors from the pretenders. He ran the toughest training programs on base and took pride in pushing everyone to their absolute limits. Sarah made her way toward the group, her gait slightly uneven. The injury still bothered her on cold mornings, though she had learned to manage the discomfort. As she approached, she caught the tail end of Colonel Parker's speech about the upcoming physical fitness evaluation. Every officer would be required to complete the full course, no exceptions. His eyes scanned the assembled group, stopping briefly on each face, as if measuring their worth. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding forest. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. The thick military-issue coat concealed more than just the chill. Beneath the fabric lay a story that most people on this base would never understand. A reminder of the price some soldiers paid in service. Colonel Parker's assistant handed out the evaluation schedules. Officers were assigned to different time slots throughout the week. Sarah glanced at her paper and saw she was scheduled for Friday morning. That gave her 3 days to prepare mentally and physically. The course included a 2-mile run, rope climbing, wall scaling, and an endurance challenge that tested both strength and stamina. As the briefing concluded, officers began to disperse. Some headed toward the gym, others toward the mess hall for breakfast. Sarah started walking back toward the barracks when she heard Colonel Parker's voice call out behind her. "Captain Mitchell, a word." She turned to face him. The colonel was a tall man in his late 50s, with gray hair cut in a severe crew cut and eyes that seemed to assess everything with military precision. He walked toward her with the confident stride of someone who had never questioned his place in the chain of command. "I've reviewed your file," he said without preamble. "Impressive combat record. 2 tours, multiple commendations, but I notice you've been here 3 weeks and haven't participated in any physical training sessions." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "I've been completing my PT independently, sir." "Independently, Elsie. You know, Captain, I've been in this man's army for 33 years. I've seen a lot of soldiers come through these gates. Some of them warriors, some of them looking for an easy ride. Physical fitness is the foundation of everything we do. Without it, we're nothing but people in costumes." There was an implication in his tone that Sarah caught immediately. He was questioning whether she was fit for duty. She felt a flash of anger but kept it contained. Years of military discipline had taught her when to speak and when to listen. "The evaluation on Friday will show you what you need to see." "Sir," she replied evenly. "I'm sure it will," Colonel Parker said, though his tone suggested skepticism. "I expect all my officers to lead by example. That means being in peak physical condition. No excuses, no special accommodations." "We're all held to the same standard here," Sarah nodded. "Understood, sir." It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her capabilities based on appearance or assumption. During her recovery, doctors had questioned if she'd ever serve again. Physical therapists had doubted she'd regain full mobility. Even some fellow soldiers had whispered behind her back that maybe it was time to take a desk job. But Sarah had fought her way. Back from the edge of medical discharge, she had learned to adapt, to modify, to overcome limitations that would have ended most military careers. The injury had taken something from her, but it had also revealed a depth of determination she hadn't known she possessed. The rest of Monday passed in a blur of administrative duties. Sarah attended meetings, reviewed reports, and familiarized herself with the base's operational procedures. But in the back of her mind, Colonel Parker's words echoed. The challenge had been issued, whether explicitly stated or not. She preferred training alone, away from curious eyes and unspoken questions. The gym was nearly empty except for a young lieutenant running on a treadmill. Sarah moved to a corner where pull-up bars and weight equipment stood. She began her routine slowly, testing her body's responses. The injury was always there, a constant companion that reminded her of its presence with each movement. But she had learned to work around it, to compensate in ways that maintained her effectiveness as a soldier. Her training might look different from standard protocol, but it achieved the same goals. She could still perform when it mattered. As Sarah completed her workout, she thought about Friday's evaluation. Colonel Parker would be watching, probably expecting her to fail or request special consideration. She smiled grimly to herself. He had no idea what she was capable of enduring. Combat had taught her that the human body could withstand far more than most people imagined. Pain was just information. Injury was just an obstacle to navigate. Tuesday morning brought another group training session that Sarah attended. Colonel Parker ran the drill himself, pushing soldiers through a series of grueling exercises. Sarah participated, keeping pace with the others despite the sharp ache that radiated through her side. She saw the colonel watching her periodically, his expression unreadable. During a water break, another captain named Jenkins approached her. He was a friendly guy who had been one of the first to welcome her to Fort Braxton. Parker's really putting everyone through it this week, Jenkins said, wiping sweat from his forehead. He gets like this before evaluations. Wants everyone sharp. Seems like a thorough commander, Sarah replied diplomatically. Jenkins laughed. That's one way to put it. He's tough but fair mostly. Just doesn't have much patience for anyone he thinks isn't pulling their weight. Lost a son in combat about 5 years ago. I think it changed something in him. Made him harder. Sarah absorbed this information. It added context to Colonel Parker's intensity, though it didn't excuse snap judgments. She knew grief could reshape a person, could make them channel pain into demanding more from those around them. The week progressed with mounting tension. Sarah continued her private training sessions, preparing her body for the evaluation course. She reviewed the obstacle specifications, mentally mapping out her approach to each challenge. The key would be efficiency and smart technique rather than pure strength. Wednesday afternoon, she overheard a conversation in the officers' lounge that made her pause. 2 lieutenants were talking about bets being placed on Friday's evaluation. Apparently, word had spread that Colonel Parker was watching certain officers closely, including the new captain who seemed to be avoiding group PT. The rumors painted her as someone looking for easy treatment or maybe hiding. Behind past combat service, Sarah felt frustration building but channeled it into determination. Let them speculate. Actions would speak louder than gossip. Thursday evening. Her jacket hung on a chair nearby, the fabric concealing the truth that would soon be revealed. She touched the area beneath her ribs absently, feeling the irregular texture through her shirt. Tomorrow would be difficult, but she had faced worse. She had survived worse. Friday morning arrived cold and clear. Sarah dressed in her PT uniform, leaving her jacket on as she made her way to the training field. A crowd had already gathered, more than usual for a standard evaluation. Word had gotten around. Officers wanted to see if the rumors were true. If the colonel would finally call out someone for seeking special treatment. Colonel Parker stood at the starting line with a clipboard, checking names as officers prepared to run the course. When Sarah approached, he looked up, and their eyes met. There was something in his expression that seemed almost like satisfaction, as if he had been waiting for this moment. The crowd of spectators had grown larger than Sarah expected. Officers who had already completed their evaluations earlier in the week had returned to watch. Word must have spread throughout the base that something interesting might happen during this session. She could feel eyes on her from every direction, could sense the anticipation hanging in the cold morning air. Colonel Parker called the group to attention. 5 officers would run the course this morning, but Sarah knew she was the one he was really focused on. His gaze kept returning to her, assessing, judging. She stood straight despite the persistent ache in her side, refusing to show any sign of discomfort. Asterisk. All right, listen up, the colonel's voice carried across the field. This evaluation is standard protocol. 2-mile run to start, then the obstacle course, finishing with the endurance stations. There's no shame in struggling with certain elements, but there is shame in not giving everything you've got. I expect maximum effort from each of you. He paused, his eyes scanning the assembled officers before landing squarely on Sarah. I also expect everyone to complete the course without excuses. We're all professionals here. We all wear the same uniform. That means we're all held to the same standards, regardless of past service or personal circumstances. The words were directed at the group, but Sarah felt them aimed specifically at her. Several other officers glanced her way, curious to see how she would respond. She kept her expression calm, almost serene. She had learned in combat that emotional control was just as important as physical capability. Never let them see you rattled. Captain Mitchell, Colonel Parker, called out directly now. You're in the second wave. That gives you about 15 minutes to warm up. I suggest you use the time wisely. Yes, sir, Sarah replied crisply. As the first group of officers moved to the starting line, Sarah began her warm-up routine. She kept her jacket on, moving through stretches and light jogging. The fabric felt heavy on her shoulders, but she wasn't ready to remove it yet. That revelation would come at the right moment, not before. Captain Jenkins jogged over, his expression concerned. You doing okay? Parker seems to have it out for you this morning. I'm fine, Sarah assured him. Just another evaluation. Look, I don't know what your situation is, and it's none of my business. But if you need to request a medical exemption or a modified course, no one would think less of you. Parker talks tough, but he follows regulations, if there's a legitimate reason. Sarah appreciated his kindness, but she shook her head. I don't need accommodations. Your call, Jenkins said, though worry still creased his forehead. Good luck out there. The first group completed their 2-mile run, returning to the field breathing heavily but in good spirits. Colonel Parker checked their times and nodded approval. These were all young officers in prime physical condition, the kind who thrived on this type of challenge. Sarah watched them tackle the obstacle course with practiced efficiency, scaling walls and climbing ropes with the ease of people who had been training for exactly this scenario. When the first group finished, Colonel Parker called for the second wave. Sarah stepped forward with 3 other officers. The colonel looked at each of them, his gaze lingering on Sarah. Before we begin, he said, his voice carrying to the spectators, I want to remind everyone what we're testing here. Physical fitness isn't just about personal achievement. It's about reliability. Your fellow soldiers need to know you can perform under pressure, that you won't become a liability when things get tough. He looked directly at Sarah now, and his next words felt like a deliberate provocation. I've seen too many people hide behind their jackets and their paperwork, claiming they're fit for duty when they're really looking for an easy assignment. This evaluation separates those who belong in the field from those who should be behind a desk. A murmur ran through the crowd. Everyone could sense the tension building. Some officers looked uncomfortable with the colonel's directness, while others seemed intrigued by the confrontation brewing. Sarah felt anger flare hot in her chest, but she kept it contained. She had dealt with worse than veiled insults from a superior officer. In combat zones, she had faced enemy fire, made life or death decisions, and carried wounded soldiers to safety. Colonel Parker's words were just noise. Something you'd like to say, Captain? The colonel asked, clearly expecting her to either defend herself or request special consideration. Sarah met his eyes steadily. No, sir. Ready to begin when you give the order. Colonel Parker's jaw tightened slightly. He had been baiting her, probably hoping she would reveal some weakness or ask for accommodation that would justify his apparent prejudice. Her calm response seemed to frustrate him. Very well, he said curtly. Runners, take your positions. Sarah moved to the starting line alongside the other 3 officers. The adrenaline coursing through her system was familiar, the same rush she had felt before combat operations. Her body knew how to channel this energy into focused performance. The starting signal sounded. The 4 officers took off running. The 2-mile course wound through the base, following paved roads and dirt paths. Sarah settled into a steady pace, not trying to lead but not falling behind either. She could feel the injury with each stride, a sharp reminder of its presence. But she had learned to run through worse discomfort during her rehabilitation. The officer beside her, a young lieutenant named Davis, kept glancing over as if expecting her to drop back. Sarah maintained her pace, controlling her breathing, staying focused on the rhythm of her movement. The key was consistency rather than speed. Finish strong, that was the goal. They rounded a turn where spectators had gathered to watch. Sarah could hear some of them placing bets, speculating on who would finish first. She blocked out the noise, concentrating on putting one foot in front of the other. Miles of desert patrol during her combat tours had taught her endurance. This was nothing compared to marching through hostile territory with full gear under the scorching sun. As they approached the final stretch of the run, Sarah picked up her pace slightly. She crossed the finish line 3rd out of 4, with a respectable time that fell well within acceptable standards. Colonel Parker checked his stopwatch and recorded her result without comment, though she could see disappointment flash across his face. He had been expecting her to struggle. 5-minute rest, then we moved to the obstacles. Colonel Parker announced Sarah used the time to catch her breath and hydrate. The real test was coming. The obstacle course required not just endurance, but strength, agility, and technique. The walls tested climbing ability, the ropes tested upper body strength, the crawl sections tested core stability. When the 5 minutes ended, Colonel Parker led them to the first obstacle, an 8-foot wall that had to be scaled without assistance. The other 3 officers went before Sarah, each clearing it with relative ease. Then it was her turn. Sarah approached the wall still wearing her jacket. She could sense Colonel Parker's attention focused entirely on her now. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the chance to see her fail or ask for help. The crowd had grown silent, everyone watching. She jumped, grabbed the top edge of the wall, and pulled herself up. The movement sent a spike of pain through her torso, but she gritted her teeth and powered through it. Years of modified pull-ups and adapted training had prepared her for this exact scenario. She swung her leg over the top and dropped down the other side. Sarah moved on to the next obstacle without waiting for his reaction. The rope climb came next. This was potentially the most challenging element, given her injury, requiring significant core engagement and upper body strength. Sarah removed her gloves, gripped the thick rope, and began to climb. Each pull upward required her to stabilize with her core muscles, and each stabilization sent discomfort radiating through her midsection. But pain was just information. Her physical therapist had repeated that mantra hundreds of times during recovery. The pain told her where her limits were, but it didn't define what she could accomplish within those limits. Sarah climbed steadily, hand over hand, until she reached the top marker. Then she controlled her descent, landing back on solid ground. Colonel Parker was now watching her with undisguised intensity. The easy narrative he had constructed, about an officer looking for special treatment, was crumbling with each obstacle she completed. Sarah could see him trying to reconcile his assumptions with the reality. Unfolding before him, the course continued through various challenges. A low crawl under barbed wire, a balance beam, a set of monkey bars, and a wall traverse. Sarah tackled each one with methodical determination. She wasn't the fastest, but she was solid and competent. More importantly, she was completing every element without modification or assistance by the time they reached the endurance stations. The final phase of the evaluation, Colonel Parker's expression had shifted from skepticism to something more complicated. He watched Sarah complete box jumps, burpees, and weighted carries with the same intensity he had shown earlier. But now there was confusion mixed with his scrutiny. Asterisk the final endurance station. Tested mental fortitude as much as physical capability. Officers had to hold a plank position for 2 minutes, followed immediately by a sprint to a marker and back, then repeat the sequence 3 times. It was designed to push soldiers past the point of comfortable exertion. To see who would quit when their muscles screamed for relief, Sarah dropped into plank position alongside the other officers. The jacket, now damp with sweat, clung to her back and shoulders. She could feel every fiber of muscle in her core engaging to maintain the position. The injury site burned with intensity, the scar tissue protesting the sustained tension. 2 minutes felt like an eternity, but she had endured far worse during her recovery. When the timer sounded, she pushed up and sprinted to the marker. Her breathing was ragged, her legs heavy, but she maintained pace with the others. Back to plank, muscles trembling now. The second round was harder, the third nearly unbearable. But Sarah had learned in combat that the human will could override the body's desire to quit. She finished all 3 rounds, the last one to complete, but still within the acceptable time frame. As she stood, trying to catch her breath, Colonel Parker approached. His clipboard was tucked under his arm, and his expression was no longer one of anticipated vindication. Instead, he looked puzzled, and perhaps a bit frustrated that his expectations had been so thoroughly challenged. "Impressive performance, Captain Mitchell," he said, though the words seemed to cost him effort. "Though I notice you've kept that jacket on throughout the entire evaluation. Most officers remove extra layers once they start sweating." It was the moment Sarah had been both anticipating and dreading. The crowd of spectators had pressed closer now, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. She could see curiosity on their faces, and on some she detected the satisfaction of people who enjoyed watching others squirm under scrutiny. Sarah looked Colonel Parker directly in the eye. "Is there a regulation against wearing a jacket during PT evaluations, sir?" "No," he admitted, "but it's unusual. Makes me wonder if you're hiding something. Maybe an injury that should disqualify you from field duty? Maybe a fitness issue you don't want documented?" The accusation hung in the air between them. Sarah felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her back. This was the colonel's final attempt to justify his prejudgment, to find some excuse that would prove his skepticism had been warranted all along. He was essentially calling her integrity into question in front of half the base's officer corps. But Sarah gave him a small shake of her head. She didn't need defending. She could handle this herself. "I'm not hiding a fitness issue, sir," Sarah said calmly. "I'm hiding evidence of service." Colonel Parker's eyebrows rose. "Evidence of service?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. Then, slowly and deliberately, she reached for the zipper of her jacket. The crowd grew absolutely silent, everyone straining to see what would be revealed. Underneath, she wore a standard-issue tank top, dark with sweat from the grueling evaluation. But it was what the tank top revealed that made the assembled crowd draw a collective breath. Sarah's left side, from below her ribs to her hip, was marked by an extensive network of scars. The primary scar was thick and raised, clearly the result of a major injury that had required multiple surgeries. Smaller scars branched off from it, evidence of shrapnel wounds and the subsequent medical procedures needed to save her life. The entire area was a testament to trauma survived and recovery achieved. But Sarah didn't stop there. She turned slightly, showing her back. More scarring crossed her shoulder blade and ran down toward her spine. Burns and shrapnel wounds painted a map of violence endured. Finally, she lifted her left arm fully, revealing the continuation of the scarring up her ribcage. Colonel Parker had gone completely still. His face had lost its skeptical hardness, replaced by something that looked like shock and dawning comprehension. The spectators were equally frozen, many of them staring in stunned silence at the evidence of combat trauma displayed before them. "I received these injuries during my second tour," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. "My convoy was hit by an IED followed by small arms fire. The explosion threw me from the vehicle and embedded shrapnel throughout my left side. I also suffered burns from the resulting fire and 3 broken ribs from impact with debris. She paused, letting the information sink in before continuing. I spent 4 months in military hospitals undergoing 7 separate surgeries to remove shrapnel, repair internal damage, and address the burns. Doctors told me I'd likely never serve again. But I proved them wrong. Colonel Parker still hadn't spoken. His clipboard hung loosely in his hand, forgotten. Sarah took a step toward him, her eyes never leaving his face. I've spent the last year in intensive rehabilitation, relearning how to move, how to train, how to perform my duties as an officer despite this injury. I wear the jacket not because I'm ashamed. The colonel finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than usual. Captain, I wear the jacket, Sarah continued. Her tone still calm, but now edged with steel, because I wanted to be judged on my performance. Not on someone's assessment of what I look like or what I can't possibly do because of an injury. I completed your evaluation course at standard requirements. I haven't asked for accommodations or special treatment. I've done everything expected of any officer on this base. She picked up her jacket but didn't put it back on, instead holding it folded in her arms. With respect, sir, you spent this entire week judging me based on your assumptions. You decided I was looking for easy treatment before you knew anything about my situation. You implied in front of the entire officer corps that I was hiding behind excuses and avoiding my responsibilities. Colonel Parker's jaw worked silently. Around them, the crowd of spectators had begun to shift uncomfortably. Some officers looked ashamed, probably remembering the rumors they had spread or the bets they had placed. Others looked angry, perhaps at the colonel for his harsh prejudgment, or at themselves for going along with it. Captain Jenkins stepped forward from the crowd. Colonel Parker, Captain Mitchell, has been training every evening in the gym after hours. I've seen her. She works harder than anyone else on this base because she has to. She's not looking for special treatment. She's working twice as hard to prove she doesn't need it. Another voice joined in, a lieutenant from the first evaluation group. Sir, she just completed the same course we all did and she did it with those injuries. That's not someone looking for easy duty. Colonel Parker held up a hand. Silencing the growing murmur of support for Sarah, he looked at her for a long moment. And Sarah could see a complex mix of emotions playing across his weathered face. Shame, certainly. Perhaps respect. Maybe even recognition of something he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Captain Mitchell, he said finally, his voice formal, but no longer harsh. I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your fitness and your commitment based on incomplete information. That was wrong of me, and it was unbecoming of an officer of my rank and experience. Sarah nodded slightly, but said nothing. She wasn't going to make this easier for him. He needed to feel the full weight of what he had done, of how his prejudice had played out in front of the entire base. Your performance today was exemplary, the colonel continued. More than that, it was inspiring. I've seen plenty of soldiers complete this course, but I've never seen one do it while overcoming the kind of obstacles you're clearly dealing with. That takes a level of determination and courage that frankly puts the rest of us to shame. He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. My son was killed in action 5 years ago. He was a captain like you. Died leading his platoon in an ambush. I've been angry about it ever since, angry at a lot of things. I think maybe I've been taking that anger out on people who don't deserve it. Looking for reasons to doubt soldiers who are out there risking everything? Sarah's expression softened slightly. She had suspected something like this might be underlying the colonel's behavior. But hearing him acknowledge it directly was different. Pain made people act in ways they normally wouldn't. She understood that better than most. Sir, she said quietly, I'm sorry for your loss, but your son's sacrifice doesn't justify. Questioning the capabilities of soldiers who are doing their best to serve honorably, we all carry scars, visible or not. What matters is whether we can still do the job. Colonel Parker nodded slowly. You're absolutely right, Captain, and you've proven today that you can do the job better than most. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong to let my personal feelings cloud my professional judgment. The training field remained silent for several moments after Colonel Parker's apology. Sarah could feel the tension slowly draining from the atmosphere, replaced by something more complex. There was respect in many of the eyes now watching her, but also discomfort at having witnessed such a public confrontation between a colonel and a captain. Sarah understood that what happened next would define not just her relationship with Colonel Parker, but her entire experience at Fort Braxton. She could accept his apology with grace and move forward, or she could hold on to the anger and resentment that would be perfectly justified given how she had been treated. The choice would reveal as much about her character as the evaluation course had revealed about her physical capabilities. "I appreciate your apology, sir," Sarah said finally, "and I accept it. We all make mistakes, and we all carry burdens that affect how we see the world. What matters is that we learn from those mistakes and do better going forward." She pulled the jacket back on, the fabric settling around her shoulders like familiar armor. "But I hope this serves as a reminder to everyone here that we can't judge a soldier's worth based on assumptions or appearances. Some of the strongest people I've served with were the ones carrying the heaviest, invisible weights. Combat changes you, injuries change you, loss changes you, but none of that means you're less capable of serving." Colonel Parker extended his hand, and Sarah shook it firmly. The gesture felt like more than just a professional courtesy. It was an acknowledgement of shared understanding, a recognition that they were both people shaped by the harsh realities of military service. "You've taught me something important today, Captain," the colonel said. "I won't forget it." As the crowd began to disperse, several officers approached Sarah to congratulate her on the evaluation performance, or to express their admiration for how she had handled the situation. Captain Jenkins clapped her on the shoulder with a broad grin. "That was incredible," he said. "You completely demolished every assumption Parker had made, and you did it with class." Lieutenant Davis, who had run the course alongside her, looked embarrassed when he approached. "Captain, I owe you an apology too. I participated in some of the speculation this week, and I feel like an idiot now." "You're tougher than any of us gave you credit for." Sarah accepted his apology with a nod. "Just remember this next time you're tempted to judge someone before you know their story." As the morning wore on and the training field emptied, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts. The confrontation with Colonel Parker had been exhausting in its own way. She had fought hard to earn respect, to prove herself worthy of wearing the uniform despite her injuries. But part of her wondered why it was necessary to fight so hard in the first place. The scars she carried weren't badges of shame. They were evidence of survival, of missions completed under impossible conditions, of comrades protected and objectives achieved. Every mark on her skin told a story of service and sacrifice. Yet she had learned that people often saw the scars before they saw the soldier, saw the injury before they saw the capability. That evening, Sarah received a message asking her to report to Colonel Parker's office. Perhaps he wanted to discuss her future assignments, or address any lingering concerns about the day's events. She arrived at the administrative building as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the base. Colonel Parker's office was exactly what she had expected. Military precision in every detail, from the aligned photographs on the wall to the perfectly organized desk. One photograph in particular caught her attention. A young man in dress uniform, smiling confidently at the camera. The colonel's son, she realized. The one who had died 5 years ago. "Thank you for coming, Captain," Colonel Parker said, gesturing to a chair. "I wanted to speak with you privately, away from the spectacle of this morning." Sarah sat, curious about where this conversation would lead. The colonel leaned back in his chair, looking more tired than he had on the training field. "I've been thinking a lot today about why I reacted to you the way I did. You were right when you said I was judging you based on assumptions. But it went deeper than that." He glanced at the photograph of his son. "When Michael died, part of me died with him. I started seeing every young officer as either someone who could have saved him, or someone who wasn't good enough to serve alongside him. It was irrational and unfair, but grief makes you irrational. I was looking for someone to blame, some way to make sense of senseless loss." Sarah listened without interrupting, recognizing the need in his voice to confess, to explain. When you arrived at Fort Braxton with your impressive combat record, I should have been grateful to have such an experienced officer on base. Instead, I looked for reasons to dismiss your capabilities. I think part of me was angry that you survived your injuries while my son didn't survive his. Again, completely irrational. But that's where my head was. Sir, Sarah said gently, you don't have to explain this to me. I think I do, Colonel Parker replied. Because you deserve to understand that my behavior wasn't really about you. It was about my own unresolved grief and anger. That doesn't excuse what I did, but it might help explain it. Pulled out a folder from his desk drawer and opened it. Sarah recognized her personnel file. I've read your full combat record now, not just the summary I glanced at before. The mission where you were injured was a rescue operation. You and your team went into hostile territory to extract wounded soldiers from an ambushed convoy. You were hit on the way out, but you still got those soldiers to safety before allowing yourself to be evacuated. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. She didn't like revisiting that day. The chaos and fear and desperate determination to save lives, even as her own body was failing. 3 soldiers survived because of your actions that day, Colonel Parker continued. 3 families got their loved ones back because you refused to quit even after being seriously wounded. That's the kind of leadership this army needs. That's the kind of officer my son would have been proud to serve with. He closed the folder and looked directly at Sarah. I'm not just apologizing for today. I'm apologizing for not recognizing your value from the moment you arrived at Fort Braxton. And I'm asking if you're willing to work with me to make this base better. We need officers who understand the real cost of service. Who can train soldiers not just in physical fitness, but in the kind of mental toughness that gets people through impossible situations. Sarah considered his words carefully. She could refuse, could maintain professional distance, and simply do her assigned duties. But she recognized in Colonel Parker something she had seen in herself during recovery. A person struggling to find meaning after trauma, trying to channel pain into something productive. I'm willing to work with you, sir, Sarah said. But on one condition. No more assumptions about what people can or can't do based on appearances. If we're going to train soldiers effectively, we need to see them as individuals with unique strengths and challenges. Agreed, Colonel Parker said immediately. In fact, I'd like you to help me redesign some of our training protocols. We've been using the same approaches for years. But maybe it's time to incorporate lessons from officers who have actually been in recent combat and understand modern warfare challenges. Over the following weeks, Sarah found her role at Fort Braxton evolving. Colonel Parker was true to his word, involving her in training program development and seeking her input on operational planning. More importantly, their public confrontation and subsequent reconciliation had shifted the culture on base. Officers began speaking more openly about their own struggles and challenges. One captain revealed he had been dealing with PTSD from his deployment and had been afraid to seek help because he thought it would be seen as weakness. A lieutenant shared that she had been struggling with a shoulder injury but had been hiding it to avoid judgment. Sarah's evening training sessions in the gym were no longer solitary. Other officers began joining her, some out of curiosity about her modified techniques, others because they were dealing with their own injuries or limitations and wanted to learn adaptive strategies. She found herself becoming an informal mentor, showing soldiers that physical limitations didn't mean the end of effective service. One evening, about 2 months after the evaluation confrontation, Sarah was working through her routine when Colonel Parker entered the gym. He had started working out at the same time, often on the other side of the facility, maintaining professional distance while also showing his commitment to physical fitness. He approached her as she finished a set of modified pull-ups. "Captain, do you have a moment?" "Of course, sir." Colonel Parker looked almost embarrassed, an unusual expression on his typically confident face. "I have a personal request. I've been struggling with a shoulder injury for about 6 months. Old age catching up with me, I suppose. I've been working through it, but I'm not making much progress. I was wondering if you might have suggestions for adaptive techniques." Sarah felt a smile tug at her lips. The proud colonel, asking for help with an injury, represented a significant shift. "I'd be happy to work with you, sir." The key is finding movements that maintain strength without aggravating the injury. It takes patience and a willingness to modify your approach. They spent the next hour working together, Sarah demonstrating techniques she had learned during her rehabilitation. Colonel Parker was a diligent student, listening carefully and asking thoughtful questions. The dynamic between them had completely transformed from that first contentious morning on the training field. As they finished the session, Colonel Parker said something that surprised Sarah. I think my son would have liked you. He always said the best officers were the ones who had been through hell and came out stronger for it. You embody that completely. Sarah felt unexpected emotion well up. Thank you, sir. That means more than you know. The months continued to pass, and Sarah became an integral part of Fort Braxton's operations. She led training exercises, mentored younger officers, and contributed to strategic planning. The jacket she had worn as protective armor became less necessary. She still wore it sometimes, particularly on cold mornings when the scars ached. But she no longer felt the need to hide evidence of her service. The story of the evaluation confrontation spread beyond Fort Braxton. Sarah received requests to speak at other bases about adaptive training techniques and resilience. She was featured in a military publication discussing the importance of supporting wounded warriors who chose to continue their service rather than take medical retirement. Colonel Parker nominated her for a commendation recognizing her contributions to improving base culture and training protocols. During the ceremony where the commendation was presented, he spoke about the lessons Sarah had taught him about looking beyond surface judgments to see the true measure of a soldier's worth. Sarah stood before the assembled officers accepting the commendation, her jacket off, scars visible. She had learned that hiding her injuries didn't protect her from judgment, it just delayed inevitable confrontations. Better to be open, to let her actions and capabilities speak for themselves. In her acceptance speech, Sarah addressed the crowd with characteristic directness. Service requires sacrifice. Sometimes that sacrifice leaves visible marks, sometimes invisible ones. But what defines us isn't the wounds we carry. Every person in this room has faced challenges and setbacks. She looked at Colonel Parker, who was watching with undisguised pride. I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve at Fort Braxton. I'm grateful for leaders who are willing to admit mistakes and grow from them. That takes as much courage as facing any enemy in combat. As the ceremony concluded and officers mingled, Sarah reflected on how far she had come since that cold morning on the training field. The confrontation with Colonel Parker could have ended her effectiveness at Fort Braxton. Instead, it had become a catalyst for positive change, both in the base culture and in her own willingness to be vulnerable. She thought about all the soldiers she had mentored over the past months. The ones who had been hiding injuries or struggling, trauma, or convinced their service was over because of physical limitations. By being open about her own journey, she had given them permission to acknowledge their challenges while still believing in their capabilities. Captain Jenkins approached with his characteristic friendly grin. So, should we start a betting pool on your next evaluation? I'm putting money on you setting a new base record. Sarah laughed. Let's not make it about betting. Let's make it about everyone doing their personal best, whatever that looks like for them. Fair enough, Jenkins agreed. Though between you and me, watching you prove Colonel Parker wrong was the best thing that's happened on this base in years. As Sarah left the ceremony and walked across the base toward her quarters, the evening sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. She still felt the persistent ache in her side, the reminder of combat trauma that would never fully disappear. But she had made peace with it. The scars weren't her enemy. They were part of her story, evidence of battles fought and survived. Her phone buzzed with a message from one of the lieutenants she had been mentoring. He had just completed a physical evaluation, despite a leg injury he had been managing for months. His message expressed gratitude for her encouragement and techniques that had helped him succeed. Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of purpose that went beyond her own achievements. The confrontation with Colonel Parker had forced her to reveal vulnerabilities she had been hiding. But in doing so, she had created space for others to do the same. The base was stronger for it, more honest about the real challenges soldiers faced and more supportive of those working through difficulties. She thought about Colonel Parker's words regarding his son, about officers who had been through hell and emerged stronger. That was the true test of military service, not whether you could complete an obstacle course or run a certain distance. It was whether you could face overwhelming odds, endure terrible setbacks, and still choose to move forward with purpose and determination. Sarah reached her quarters and paused at the door, looking back across the base. Soldiers jogged past in formation. Officers moved between buildings, handling administrative duties. The machinery of military life continued its steady rhythm. She was part of that rhythm now, no longer fighting to prove her place, but simply filling it with competence and commitment. The jacket hung on a hook inside her room, ready for when she needed it. But she no longer needed it as armor against judgment. Colonel Parker's public acknowledgement of his mistake and her handling of that difficult moment had established her credibility more effectively than any amount of hiding could have achieved. Authenticity, she had learned, was its own form of strength. Being willing to show the full truth of who you were, scars and all, took more courage than maintaining a perfect facade.